A desperate single mother gave her sick child's only blanket to a shivering stranger, unaware he was the city's most powerful and grief-stricken billionaire. Can you read this letter? It's very important. The rain hammered down on the cracked pavement like 1,000 desperate fists, relentless and wild. It was a cold, unforgiving downpour that seeped into the very bones of the city, turning the flickering streetlights into smeared, weeping halos of amber hue. Alara clutched the thin fabric of her worn coat tighter, the biting cold a familiar but unwelcome companion as she hurried along the gleaming, wet streets, a small, threadbare bag of groceries held protectively against her chest. Each step was a quiet, dignified battle against the wind that sought to steal the last of her warmth. She was weary. Her world had shrunk to the size of a small, drafty apartment and the even smaller circumference of her daughter Lily's fragile health. The days bled into one another in a grayscale of worry, a relentless cycle of working menial jobs, counting every single coin, and sitting by Lily's bedside, her own heart thudding in time with the child's shallow breaths. Tonight, the weight of it all felt unbearable, a physical pressure that made her shoulders ache and her spirit feel as brittle as autumn leaves. The doctor's words from the morning echoed in the sterile silence of her mind, a pronouncement of expensive tests and treatments that felt as distant and impossible as the moon. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was alone. Yet, even in the depths of her despair, Alara possessed a quiet resolve, an unwavering inner strength that refused to be extinguished. It was the same strength that propelled her out of bed each morning and the same strength that allowed her to smile for Lily, a sincere, gentle expression that masked the hollow ache inside. She navigated her world of hardship not with bitterness, but with a profound, unspoken grace that was almost sacred. She was a ghost in the bustling city, a shadow moving through the lives of others, her own suffering unseen and unacknowledged. But she didn't know it yet, this quiet, unassuming woman, that on this night of pounding rain and shattered hopes, her entire universe was about to splinter and reform around a single, selfless act. An act that would echo into the highest echelons of power and awaken a heart long thought dead. She was almost home. As she rounded the corner onto her own street, a desolate stretch of crumbling brick and tired storefronts, she saw him. He was a silhouette huddled in the darkened alcove of a closed bookshop, a man made of shadows and misery. The rain had soaked him completely, plastering his dark hair to his skull and dripping from the sharp line of his jaw. He wore no coat, only a thin, dark sweater that clung to his frame, offering no protection from the relentless assault of the weather. He wasn't shivering violently. It was a deeper, more profound tremor, a shudder that seemed to originate from the very core of his being. His face, when a passing car's headlights swept across it, was a mask of such utter desolation it made Alara's own breath catch in her throat. His eyes were haunted, staring into the middle distance as if watching a world only he could see crumble to dust. He seemed not just lost, but erased. She hesitated, her own problems a heavy weight on her shoulders. She had nothing, less than nothing. The groceries in her bag were barely enough for 2 days, and the last of her savings had been spent on Lily's latest prescription. Every rational thought screamed at her to walk on, to seek the meager shelter of her own home and forget the stranger in the rain. Her daughter was waiting, but something in his stillness, in the profound loneliness that radiated from him like a physical force, stopped her. She saw in his hollow eyes a reflection of her own deepest fears, the terror of being utterly and completely alone in a cold, indifferent world. It was a kinship of suffering, an unspoken understanding that transcended their circumstances. Her heart, a muscle conditioned by love and sacrifice, made the decision for her. She could not just walk by. Slowly, she approached him, her footsteps soft on the wet concrete. He didn't seem to notice her until she was standing directly in front of him, a small, dripping figure against the vast, dark night. She fumbled with the worn strap of her bag, her fingers numb with cold. Inside, nestled among the bread and milk, was Lily's small travel blanket. It was a faded pink flannel, threadbare from years of love, with tiny, embroidered yellow ducks along the border. It was one of the few things they had left from before, from a time of warmth and security. It always smelled faintly of Lily, of baby powder and innocent dreams, and her daughter could not sleep without clutching it to her chest. It was, in its own small way, a sacred object. Alara pulled it out, the fabric soft and warm against her cold hands. She unfolded it carefully. He finally looked at her then, his eyes focusing with a slow, painful effort. They were the color of a stormy sea, deep and full of a raw, ancient grief. A flicker of confusion crossed his features, but he said nothing. He just watched as she, a complete stranger, stepped closer into the small, cramped alcove. Without a word, she gently draped the small, warm blanket over his trembling shoulders. The pink flannel was a stark, innocent splash of color against the bleakness of his dark, soaked sweater. He froze. For a moment, the only sound was the relentless hammering of the rain and the soft, almost inaudible gasp that escaped his lips. He looked from the blanket to her face, his gaze searching, questioning. He saw no pity in her eyes, only a steady, sincere compassion. "You're soaked," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the storm. "It's not much, but it's warm." She then reached back into her grocery bag and pulled out the small thermos of lukewarm tea she had been saving for herself. It was her one small comfort at the end of a long day. She unscrewed the cap and held it out to him. Here the gesture was simple, offered without expectation or agenda. It was a pure, selfless act of kindness, a tiny light in an overwhelming darkness. She was giving him what little she had, at her own expense, to a man she did not know. The cost was immeasurable. The blanket meant a difficult night with a restless, sick child. The tea meant her own small comfort was gone. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the shared humanity in a cold, dark doorway. This single moment would change everything. Alistair Vance had not felt anything in 5 years. Not since the day the world had turned to ash and silence. He lived in a cavernous penthouse that overlooked the entire city, a sterile glass and steel cage where polished marble floors echoed the emptiness in his soul. He was the CEO of a global empire, a man whose name was a synonym for power and ruthless efficiency, whose decisions could shift markets and shape futures. But inside, he was a ghost, haunted by the phantom laughter of a wife and the memory of a small hand clutching his. Grief was not a visitor in his house. It was the foundation, the walls, the very air he breathed. He had tried everything to numb the unbearable pain. Work, isolation, the pursuit of even greater wealth. Nothing worked. The world had become a transactional, colorless place, and he had become a spectator, cold and detached. He had started taking these walks at night, dressed in simple clothes, wandering the city's arteries, hoping to feel something, anything. The cold, the rain, a moment of connection that wasn't bought or sold. He was searching for a sign that the world still contained something pure. And then she appeared, a fragile woman with weary eyes that held the strength of mountains. When she draped that small, worn blanket over his shoulders, it wasn't the warmth of the flannel he felt. It was a seismic shock to his system, a jolt of such profound, unexpected kindness that it cracked the thick ice that had encased his heart for half a decade. The blanket smelled of childhood and safety, a scent so innocent it was almost painful. It was a sacred thing he knew instinctively, not a throwaway object. And then the tea, offered with such simple, dignified grace. He stared at the steam rising from the cup, his hand trembling as he reached out to take it. His fingers brushed hers, and the fleeting contact was like a lightning strike, a sudden, searing connection to another human being. He saw the worn fabric of her coat, the paleness of her skin, the deep exhaustion etched around her gentle eyes. He knew, with the sharp instinct of a man who dealt in valuations, that this woman had nothing, and she was giving it to him. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. They sounded hollow, utterly insufficient for the magnitude of what he was feeling. A sob caught in his throat, raw and unexpected. For the first time in 5 years, Alistair Vance felt the sting of tears. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a poor woman, but a queen in disguise, possessed of a wealth he could never acquire. She was goodness. She was hope. In that moment, watching her stand in the pouring rain, having given him her meager comforts, Alistair's life, which had been a long, slow funeral procession, was suddenly given a new, undeniable purpose. He had to find her again. He had to know her name. He had to repay this sacred, impossible debt. Alara simply nodded, a small, tired smile gracing her lips. "Stay warm," she whispered, and then, before he could say another word, before he could ask her name or where she was going, she turned and vanished into the rain-swept darkness, a fleeting angel who had appeared and disappeared just as quickly. He was left alone in the alcove, the lukewarm tea warming his frozen hands, a small pink blanket draped over his shoulders, and his heart, for the first time in an eternity, thudding with a strange, new, and terrifying rhythm. It was the sound of being reborn. He stood there for a long time, long after the rain had softened to a drizzle, clutching the threadbare flannel as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. He was no longer cold. The consequence of Alara's kindness was swift and cruel. That night, Lily was restless, her small body shivering without the comfort of her familiar blanket. Alara held her close, humming soft lullabies and piling her own thin coat over the child's bed. But a deep, rattling cough had settled in Lily's chest. By morning, her fever had spiked. Alara had to call in to her cleaning job at the sterile, upscale law firm, her voice trembling as she explained the situation to her impatient supervisor. There was no sympathy, only a cold, clipped dismissal and the sharp click of the phone being hung up. When she tried to call back, the line was busy. An hour later, a text message arrived, curt and brutal. Her services were no longer required. She was fired. Desperation, cold and sharp, pierced through her. The last of her safety net was gone. The rent was due in a week, and Lily's new prescription sat unfilled at the pharmacy, its price tag an insurmountable wall. The world felt like it was closing in, the walls of her tiny apartment pressing down on her. She spent the day in a frantic haze, sponging Lily's forehead, making calls to temp agencies that went unanswered, and staring at the dwindling contents of her pantry. The city outside, once a place of anonymous struggle, now felt like a predator, its towering buildings casting long, menacing shadows. She felt the familiar, hollow ache of failure, the bitter taste of a world that rewards the ruthless and punishes the gentle. Her one act of spontaneous compassion for a stranger had cost her dearly, and a small, dark part of her wondered if it had been a foolish mistake. But then she would look at Lily's sleeping face, so innocent and pure, and she would banish the thought. Kindness could never be a mistake. It was the only thing she truly owned. Meanwhile, across the city, Alistair Vance was a man possessed. He had returned to his penthouse at dawn, still wrapped in the small pink blanket, the empty thermos clutched in his hand. He had not slept. He had instead mobilized the entire force of his considerable resources. His head of security, a former intelligence officer named Marcus, was summoned before sunrise. The task was simple, yet monumental. Find the woman from the bookshop alcove. The only clues were a vague description, a threadbare pink blanket, and an old thermos. It was an impossible task, but Marcus had seen the look in Alistair's eyes, a commanding fire that had been extinguished for 5 long years. He didn't ask questions. He just got to work. They scoured security footage from every camera in a 10-block radius. They ran facial recognition software on the grainy images they managed to capture. They cross-referenced pharmacy records for prescriptions filled in the area, looking for a woman with a sick child. For 2 days there was nothing. Alistair grew more agitated, the renewed purpose in his soul warring with the fear that she had been a mirage, a dream sent to torment him. He kept the pink blanket on his desk, a constant, tangible reminder of his mission. He would touch the worn fabric, remembering the sincerity in her weary eyes, the quiet dignity in her posture. He was not just looking for a woman. He was looking for the part of himself he thought had died. He was looking for his salvation. Then, on the third day, Marcus found her. A grainy image from a convenience store camera showed her buying milk and bread. A name from a credit card transaction that had nearly been maxed out. Alara Jensen. An address in a rundown tenement building. A record of a daughter, Lily, with a history of respiratory illness. A recent termination of employment. The picture of her hardship was stark and brutal. A wave of protective fury washed over Alistair. The world had taken so much from this woman, and yet she had still found it in her heart to give to him. He now knew what he had to do. He wouldn't just repay her, he would remake her world. He would become her hidden savior. The first miracle was subtle. Alara returned from a discouraging trip to the pharmacy. The pharmacist's condescending refusal to give her an advance on Lily's medication still ringing in her ears, to find a crisp white envelope slid under her apartment door. There was no name, no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for 3 months' rent, made out to her landlord. She gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the slip of paper, her trembling fingers tracing the official-looking print. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. She called her landlord, her voice a nervous whisper, and he confirmed it. The rent was paid in full. He had no idea who had sent it. Alara sank onto her worn sofa, a mixture of disbelief and profound relief washing over her. She wept. The anonymous acts of kindness continued. A large box of groceries appeared on her doorstep the next morning, filled with fresh fruit, organic vegetables, and all of Lily's favorite snacks, things Alara hadn't been able to afford in years. A few days later, a package arrived from a high-end toy store containing a beautiful, handcrafted wooden doll and a set of art supplies. Lily's eyes, which had been dull with fever, lit up with a joy that was more precious to Alara than any fortune. Then came the notice from the utility company that her account had been paid ahead for the next year. Each gift was a mystery, a silent, powerful force rearranging the harsh landscape of her life. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. Who was doing this? Why? It felt like she was being watched by a benevolent ghost, a guardian angel she couldn't see. She didn't know it was the man from the rainy night, orchestrating her rescue from a sleek, minimalist office high above the city, watching over her through the careful, discreet reports from his security team. He was healing her life from a distance, piece by piece, before he dared to step back into it. Alistair knew he couldn't remain a shadow forever. The reports from Marcus painted a picture of a woman regaining her footing but still isolated, still fighting her battles alone. Lily's health was stable but precarious. Alara was looking for work, but her options were limited. He needed to see her again, not as a powerful benefactor, but as a person. He needed to close the loop that had begun in the rain-soaked alcove. He orchestrated their next meeting with the same meticulous precision he applied to a corporate acquisition. He learned from Marcus that Alara took Lily to a small, quiet park every afternoon that the weather was good, a small patch of green in a concrete desert. He waited. He chose a crisp autumn day when the sunlight was golden and the air was clean. He wasn't the shivering, desolate man from the storm. He was Alistair Vance, dressed in an impeccable but understated cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. He looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine, a stark contrast to the haggard ghost she had met before. He sat on a bench, pretending to read a book, his heart pounding a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. Then he saw them. Alara was pushing Lily on a swing, her face tilted up towards her daughter, a genuine, unburdened smile gracing her lips. It was a smile so pure and full of love that it took Alistair's breath away. Lily's laughter, clear and bright, echoed in the quiet park. It was a sound he hadn't realized how much he'd missed. He stood up and walked towards them, his steps feeling both heavy and light. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Alara turned, and her eyes widened in recognition. It wasn't immediate, but as she took in his face, no longer gaunt and shadowed by grief, but clear and focused, the memory clicked into place. She saw the storm-colored eyes. She froze. "You're," she started, her voice a whisper. "The man from the rain." Alistair offered a small, tentative smile. "I am." I never got a chance to thank you properly. He held out a small, neatly folded object. It was the pink blanket, freshly laundered and pressed. Or to return this. I believe it belongs to your daughter. The moment was charged with an unspoken current. Alara took the blanket, her fingers brushing his, and the same jolt from that rainy night passed between them again, this time brighter, warmer. How did you find us? She asked, her mind racing, trying to connect the shivering man in the doorway to the polished, commanding figure standing before her. It's a small city, he said, the lie smooth and practiced. I've been hoping I'd run into you. My name is Alistair. He extended a hand. She took it, her own small and lost in his. Alara, the connection was forged. They began to talk. The conversation started awkwardly, a dance of polite questions and careful answers. But as the golden afternoon light deepened to an amber hue, the walls began to come down. He asked about Lily, and Alara found herself pouring out the story of her daughter's illness, her struggles as a single mother, the constant worry that was her life's soundtrack. He listened with an intensity that was startling. His unwavering gaze made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy solutions. He just listened, his steady presence a balm to her frayed nerves. Days turned into weeks. Their meetings in the park became a ritual. Alistair would appear with coffee, with pastries, with a new book for Lily. He was gentle, patient, and deeply kind. He never spoke of wealth or power. He presented himself as a simple man, an investment consultant who worked from home. He slowly, carefully wove himself into the fabric of their small lives. Alara found herself looking forward to his visits, to his quiet chuckle and the sad wisdom in his eyes. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee he brought, a feeling she had long thought was dead. She was beginning to hope again. One evening, as a biting cold wind signaled the coming of winter, they took shelter in a small, quiet cafe after their walk. The place was warm, smelling of cinnamon and coffee, the lights low and intimate. Lily was asleep in her stroller, a peaceful, gentle rhythm to her breathing. It was in this safe, dimly lit space that the confessions began. Alistair, his face etched with a familiar sorrow in the flickering light, started to speak. He told her about his wife, Amelia, and his son, Leo. He spoke of their life together, a life so full of light and laughter it seemed like a dream. And then he told her about the accident. A drunk driver, a rainy night, a single moment that had shattered his world into a million irreparable pieces. His voice didn't crack, but it was hollow, worn thin by the retelling of a story that was carved into his very soul. He spoke of the silence, the cavernous, unbearable silence of his home, of his life. He confessed that the night they met, he had been standing in that alcove for hours, trying to work up the courage to simply let the cold take him. Alara listened, her own heart aching in sympathy. She didn't speak. She simply reached across the small table and placed her hand over his. A simple, empathetic gesture. A silent message. You are not alone. He looked up, his storm-colored eyes glistening with unshed tears, and in them, she saw the same profound grief she had seen that first night. But this time it was not a stranger's pain. It was Alistair's. When he finished, the silence that fell between them was not empty, but full of a shared, unspoken understanding. It was then her turn. She told him about her own husband, a good man who had died of a sudden illness just after Lily was born, leaving her with a mountain of medical debt and a broken heart. She spoke of her cruel ex-mother-in-law, Mrs. Gable, a wealthy, powerful woman who had cut her off completely, blaming Alara for her son's decision to leave the family empire to become a teacher. They had forged a bond over their shared tragedies, two shipwrecked souls who had found each other on a lonely shore. The night ended with a moment of gentle physical contact, his hand covering hers on the table, a silent promise of protection and companionship. They were no longer just friends. Something deeper, more profound had taken root. The true test, however, was yet to come. Lily's condition took a sudden, frightening turn. A severe respiratory infection landed them in the city's public hospital, a place of sterile silence and bureaucratic indifference. The doctors recommended a new, experimental treatment, a life-saving drug that was not covered by any insurance and cost a staggering sum of money. Alara's world once again crumbled. Alistair was out of the country on an urgent business trip. In reality, he was in Switzerland finalizing the acquisition of the very pharmaceutical company that produced the drug Lily needed, a final, grand gesture he was planning. He was unreachable. Alara was alone. Desperate, she went to the one person she knew had the resources to help, her former mother-in-law, Eleanor Gable. She found her holding court at a lavish charity luncheon in the opulent ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel. Alara, in her simple, worn coat, was a stark contrast to the gleaming, ornate surroundings and the impeccably dressed guests. She waited until the event was winding down, approaching Mrs. Gable's table with quiet, dignified desperation. "Eleanor," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need your help. Lily is... She's very sick." Mrs. Gable looked up, her face a mask of cold disdain. The woman was the personification of cruelty and elitism. "And what does that have to do with me?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous, drawing the attention of the other women at the table. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The public stage was set. This was the scene of intense public humiliation. Mrs. Gable stood up, her voice rising to a theatrical pitch. "Look at this, everyone. The little gold digger who ruined my son's life. Now coming to me for a handout." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Alara. "My son was destined for greatness," Mrs. Gable sneered. "Until he met you. You, with your simple mind and your common ways, you pulled him down. And now you come crawling back, using his child as a pawn." Alara stood her ground, her face pale but her gaze unflinching. "This isn't about me. This is about your granddaughter. She needs medicine to live." Mrs. Gable laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "If you can't afford to care for a child, you shouldn't have had one. You do not belong here." She made a show of opening her crisp, polished handbag and pulling out a single coin. She flicked it onto the floor, where it spun with a mocking clatter on the polished marble. "There. That's all you'll ever get from me." The humiliation was complete. Alara's eyes filled with tears, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and utter despair. She was overwhelmed. She was shattered. And then, a calm, commanding voice cut through the heavy fog of the silent ballroom. "I believe you've dropped this." The crowd parted. Alistair Vance stood at the entrance, looking not like a man who had just stepped off a transatlantic flight, but like a king surveying his court. He was dressed in a sleek, dark suit that screamed power. His presence was a physical force that shifted the very atmosphere of the room. He walked calmly to where the coin lay, bent down and picked it up. He strode to Mrs. Gable's table, his eyes never leaving her face. He was calm but powerful. "And I believe," he continued, his voice dangerously soft, "you've made a terrible mistake." Mrs. Gable faltered, recognizing him instantly. Everyone in this room knew who Alistair Vance was. "Mr. Vance," she stammered. I didn't realize." Alistair ignored her, turning his full attention to Alara. His stormy eyes softened as they met hers, filled with a raw, protective tenderness. "I'm so sorry I'm late," he whispered, for her ears only. Then he turned back to the stunned room. His powerful monologue began. "For those of you who do not know this woman," he announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Her name is Alara Jensen, and she is the kindest, most selfless, and most dignified person I have ever had the privilege of knowing." He held up the coin. "On a night when she had nothing, she gave a stranger her warmth and her comfort, with no expectation of reward. That stranger was me." A sharp gasp went through the crowd. "This woman," he said, his voice rising with controlled fury as he looked directly at Mrs. Gable, "has more integrity and worth in her little finger than you have in your entire, hollow existence." He then publicly offered his protection, reversing the power dynamic completely. "Mrs. Gable, you seem to be under the impression that wealth is a measure of a person's value. Allow me to correct you." He pulled out his phone and made a quiet call. "Marcus, Yes, it's done. Liquidate all Gable assets from the portfolios. All of them, and buy the debt of their primary holding company. I want it on my desk by morning. He hung up, his eyes cold as ice. Mrs. Gable's face went white. She had just been publicly and financially ruined. As for Lily, Alistair said, his voice softening again as he turned back to Alara, you don't have to worry about a thing. He looked around the room. As of 3 hours ago, I am the majority shareholder of the pharmaceutical company that produces her medication. The hospital she is in, I sit on its board of directors. Her treatment will be administered this afternoon, free of charge, and she will have the best care in the world for the rest of her life. He reached out and took Alara's hand, his touch steady and sure. The salvation was complete. The antagonist was left speechless. In the aftermath of the public salvation, the world moved with dizzying speed. Alistair swept Alara away from the stunned silence of the ballroom and straight to the hospital. True to his word, a team of the world's leading specialists was already assembling, a vial of the life-saving drug waiting. Alistair never left her side. He held her hand as they watched the first dose being administered to Lily, a clear liquid flowing into her small body, a promise of a future that had been all but stolen. He stood with her in the sterile hallway, his arm a warm, steady presence around her shoulders as she finally allowed the tears of relief to fall. He didn't offer words. He offered presence. He offered security. He solved all her problems, not with the cold transaction of a benefactor, but with the tender care of someone who loved her. That night, after Lily was settled in a private, sun-filled room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital ward, Alistair took Alara to his home. The penthouse was breathtaking, a palace of glass and steel with a view that made the city look like a carpet of scattered jewels. It was beautiful, but Alara could feel the deep, profound loneliness that had been its primary inhabitant. They stood on the balcony, the cool night air wrapping around them, the city's relentless hum a soft hush from this height. It was here that he made his romantic declaration. Alara, he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. When I met you, I was a ghost. I was waiting to die. You, with your small blanket and your quiet strength, you brought me back to life. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. You showed me that there was still goodness in the world. You showed me that my heart could still feel something. His gaze was unwavering, an undeniable promise in their depths. I don't want to be your hidden savior anymore. I want to stand by your side in the light. I love you, Alara. I have loved you since that first moment in the rain. Alara's heart, which had been through so much despair and so much surprise, finally found its home. I love you too, Alistair, she whispered, and the words were the most natural, truest thing she had ever said. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, cathartic kiss that sealed their shared past and promised a shared future. 1 year later, the golden sunlight of a late afternoon streamed through the cavernous windows of Alistair's stately mansion, which was now their home. The sterile silence was gone, replaced by the sound of life. The sound of Lily's bright, unrestrained laughter echoed from the sprawling gardens, where she was chasing butterflies, her cheeks rosy with health, her lungs strong and clear. Alara watched from the terrace, a mug of warm tea in her hands, a soft, serene smile on her face. The weary, haunted look in her eyes was a distant memory, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. She had started a charitable foundation, funded by Alistair, dedicated to helping single parents and sick children, the very people she had once been. She was turning her past suffering into a source of hope for others. Alistair came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He was no longer the cold, cynical CEO or the grief-stricken ghost. He was a man remade by love, his eyes full of warmth and adoration as he looked at his family. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his lips brushing her hair. "I was just thinking," she said, leaning back into his embrace. "About a rainy night and a threadbare pink blanket." He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. The best investment I ever made. They stood together, watching their daughter play, two broken souls made whole by a single, selfless act of kindness. They had their perfect, idyllic life. This story, at its heart, is a fable. It's a testament to the idea that the smallest act of kindness can create ripples that change the course of destiny. It reminds us that true wealth is not measured in dollars or possessions, but in the compassion we show to one another. Alara, in her moment of deepest hardship, had nothing to give but her own humanity, and it turned out to be the most valuable currency in the world. Alistair, who had everything money could buy, was saved by a gift that cost nothing. Their journey from a dark, rainy alcove to a sunlit garden is a profound metaphor for redemption, proving that even the most shattered hearts can be mended by love, and that a single, pure act can illuminate the darkest of worlds. If this story touched your heart, it's because it speaks to a universal truth we all recognize, that in our moments of greatest need, what we crave most is not pity, but connection. It's a reminder that we are all, in our own ways, both the virtuous sufferer and the hidden savior, capable of both receiving and giving grace when it is least expected. The world can often feel like a cold and unforgiving place, but stories like this reignite our faith in the quiet power of goodness. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales for more soul-stirring stories that will warm your heart and inspire your spirit. We believe in the power of narrative to heal and connect, and with your support, we can continue to bring these inspiring tales of love and redemption to the world. We'll see you in the next one.